Is John Piper a perfectionist? Or is his congregation full of perfectionists? Because Piper implies that he's perfect, or that his congregation is perfect. He says that they experience the Psalms, and the person described in the Psalms, the psalmist, is perfect. I'll read some verses in a second where he says, God, you've rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. My foot never slips. I know no evil. Now, anyone who can say that, and this isn't referring to imputed righteousness. The psalmist is claiming a personal righteousness which he has established. This is a righteousness in the psalmist, not on the psalmist. He's not referring to the garments of salvation. Like when you read Isaiah and Jeremiah, they refer to the garments of salvation, the robes of righteousness. They're referring to an external righteousness which was given to them by God. That is the righteousness of the Messiah that was imputed to them. It was on them, upon them. It wasn't in them. But the psalmist is claiming a righteousness in him, as I will soon show. But to begin with Piper, Piper says to his congregation in a sermon, most of you, when you read the Psalms, you see yourselves so often. The experience of the psalmist is your experience. And that is no accident. God put the Psalms in the Bible not only to call us to great heights of praise and worship, but also to comfort us in very dark seasons of discouragement and doubt. End quote. Now, I actually kind of agree. Believers are comforted by the Word. The apostles did comfort the people they were writing to in the New Testament by the Psalms. But was it by them saying, did the apostles say, oh, look at David, look at Asaph, you're just like them, you're in the pits, God's wrath is upon you, God's fury is upon you? No, they appealed solely to Christ in the Psalms and showed his character embedded throughout the entire Psalms in order to comfort the recipients of their epistles. Whereas Piper is trying to say, oh, get comfort from David, he went through what you went through, he was abandoned by God, he was forsaken by God, you'll be forsaken too. I don't understand how anyone's going to be comforted by that. Whereas compare that to saying Christ was forsaken, so believers will never be forsaken. So why do I think Piper is a perfectionist? Well, take a look at these Psalms. Psalm 17. The psalmist says, you will test my heart, you will visit me in the night, you will refine me, you will find nothing. My thoughts do not pass beyond my mouth. My steps have kept in your tracks, so that my strides have not slipped. So the psalmist is saying he's perfect, God would find nothing, no sin in him whatsoever, because his foot never slips from the law of God. And perhaps if Piper had looked more at Hebrews, for example, Hebrews chapter 7, for such a high priest was fitting for us, holy, harmless, undefiled, and separated from sinners, and having become higher than the heavens. You could have seen the similarity between that and verse 4 of Psalm 17, which we're looking at. As to the doings of men, by the words of your lips, I keep from the paths of the violent. So he's separated from sinners, and his foot does not slip. In other words, he's holy, harmless, and undefiled. And just to bring the point right home, that this is not our experiences. This is not the experience of any believer. The only experience a believer has with this is to see Christ in them crucified. If you look at Psalm 17, verse 15, it says, as for me in righteousness, I will look upon your face. When I awaken, I shall be satisfied in your image. Now, a friend of mine pointed out something really interesting the other day, that in 1 Peter 1, Peter actually says that the prophets prophesied concerning the sufferings belonging to Christ and the glories after these. But I checked out all the prophets, and I can't find many references. There's a reference in Hosea 2 verse 6 to the resurrection, and obviously Jonah has an application to the resurrection. However, there's not much else outside the Psalms. So it seems like Peter's actually referring to the Psalms here when he says the Spirit of Christ made clear within the prophets, testifying beforehand of the sufferings of Christ. It was the Spirit of Christ speaking in them. It wasn't their own spirit. And you can see in Psalm 30, his anger is only for a moment, weeping may endure in the evening, but joy comes in the morning. Obviously another reference to the resurrection. And Psalm 16, you will not leave my soul in Sheol. You will not give your Holy One to see corruption. And also Psalm 49, but God will redeem my soul from the hand of Sheol. He will take me, for he will take me. So we see that resurrection is a common theme in the Psalms. It's hardly a theme in any of the other books of the prophets. So Peter must be referring to the Spirit of Christ speaking in Asaph, David, and so on, about himself. He's not talking about their experiences. So we can't say the Psalms are our experience unless we're going to say we're perfect or something. To bring the point home, Psalm 7, the psalmist says, "Judge me according to my righteousness, according to the integrity in me," and claims in Psalm 101 that he will behave himself in a perfect way and not know evil. In fact, in Psalm 18 he talks about the cleanness of his own hands and so on. So we see he's claiming a perfect righteousness of his own. It must be Christ, it's not our experiences. And to say the Psalms are about us and they're our experiences has fatal consequences. We've already looked at one. It leads to self-righteousness, arrogance, Pharisaism, to think that it's your righteousness that gets you into heaven, when it's really Christ describing his own righteousness. The second fatal consequence is it destroys the doctrine of assurance of salvation. For example, Piper says, quote, "We must learn to wait for the Lord. King David gave us an example of this in Psalm 40. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog. Here is a man after God's own heart, 1 Samuel 13:14, who spent time in the pit of destruction and in the miry bog, where there was no song in his mouth. How long was he there? We are not told." And Piper in many sermons and books says that this is a common experience of all believers. So I would say this is the second fatal consequence of applying the Psalms not to Jesus but to ourselves. It leads to us to think that all those verses in the Psalms that are describing Christ forsaken, the wrath of God upon Christ, Christ accursed, if we apply them to ourselves, it's like trying to put yourself under the hell that Christ experienced on the cross. So instead of being comforted by the atonement, suddenly you're trying to make an atonement for your own sins. I wonder with Piper if he says that God puts us in a pit of destruction and it wasn't Christ he put just in the pit of destruction, we have to do it too. Does Piper think Christ's work is complete, or do we have to undergo an atonement as well? And secondly, how long are we left in the pit of destruction? Well, we are told in the Psalms. That's actually a false view. We know how long the psalmist was under the pit of destruction. A psalm I quoted earlier says that his anger only endured for a moment. In other words, it was on the cross. That's Psalm 30 verse 5. His anger is only for a moment. So what I want to know from Piper is, if God puts believers into a pit of destruction, into a miry bog, and abandons them, forsakes them, what is it that causes that? And if it's sin, then aren't you holding to a conditional view of salvation where the believer's enjoyment of eternal life is based upon his own works? And if God was to come back and to shine his face again upon the believer and to restore the believer's assurance, then wouldn't that be because the believer met some condition or was good enough, and therefore wouldn't the believer's relationship with God, his standing before God, be based not on the work of Christ but on his own self-righteousness? And you have to find Piper's interpretation particularly disturbing when you consider that Psalm 40 is directly applied in Hebrews 10 to Christ. But this is not a one-off thing for Piper to apply these Psalms to his congregation and to himself. Elsewhere he says, quote, "Again and again the psalmist cried to God that he hide not his face from them. For example, in Psalm 27 verses 7 and 9, David says, 'Hear, O Lord, when I cry, be gracious to me and answer me. Hide not thy face from me.' Hide not thy face from me is the same as saying, be gracious to me. If he turns his face away, we are dismayed." Now, it's kind of disappointing, but not really surprising, that Piper overlooks the parallel between verse 12 of Psalm 27, the many false witnesses have risen up against the psalmist, and Matthew 27 verse 60, the many false witnesses came forward to Christ. You can kind of see the parallels throughout the Psalms repeatedly between Christ and the psalmist. And was it just that Christ was arbitrarily picking the Psalms and saying, hey, look, my experience is kind of similar to the experience in David's diaries. Why don't I just quote them and say I'm fulfilling prophecy? So you wouldn't be fulfilling prophecy if you wrote a diary and someone happened to pick it up 50 years later and had similar experiences to you. They wouldn't be fulfilling them. Instead, this is what's called a coincidence. You happen to have similar experience as someone else. So are the Psalms just coincidentally similar? Or, as 1 Peter said before, was it the Spirit of Christ speaking in them?